You were trained to be desirable, not to be free. Every woman carries two selves, the one she shows the world and the one she hides from it. The first smiles, performs, pleases. The second watches silently, from the dark, unfiltered, raw, unashamed. That hidden self is the shadow feminine. She is not evil. She is not chaos. She is simply everything the world told her to suppress. When a woman loses contact with that shadow, she becomes incomplete. She becomes good, but hollow, beautiful, but blind to her own power. She lives in fragments, oscillating between control and collapse. Carl Jung wrote that what we repress does not disappear, it waits. The dark feminine waits in dreams, in jealousy, in the quiet ache of unspoken anger. She waits in the attraction to danger, the fascination with mystery, the longing for depth that polite life can never offer. She's the whisper in the night that says, "You are meant for more than being chosen, you are meant to choose." But she cannot emerge through approval. She appears only through awareness. You cannot seduce her. You must summon her through truth, not desire. Because the dark feminine is not a lover. She is an initiator. She doesn't want to make you comfortable. She wants to make you conscious. When a woman begins to awaken this shadow, her energy changes. Her laughter deepens. Her eyes stop performing. Her silence grows potent. It's no longer flirtation. It's revelation. This awakening terrifies men who have only known the surface of femininity, the soft, compliant, yielding mask. Because the dark feminine doesn't yield. She mirrors. She exposes every hidden motive, every unconscious attempt at control. She doesn't ask to be seen, she sees you. And if you are not ready to face yourself, her presence feels like danger. But to the conscious man, she is not danger. She is depth. She is the mirror of the anima, the internal feminine that awakens the soul's evolution through tension. Jung called this process individuation, the journey from persona to wholeness. In that journey, the feminine shadow is not the enemy of light. She is its gatekeeper. To reach her heart, you must first pass through her darkness, not to conquer it, but to integrate it. She wants one thing only, truth. Not the truth of words, but of presence. The kind that doesn't flinch when she withdraws, or burn when she confronts. Because the shadow feminine will test your depth through paradox. She will love you and challenge you in the same breath. She will withdraw when you chase and soften when you stay. She will punish your ego to liberate your essence. And when she senses that your awareness can hold her, that your gaze can meet her storm without judgment, something alchemical begins to unfold. Her defenses begin to dissolve. Her sensuality becomes sacred. Her anger becomes clarity. Her chaos becomes creativity. She no longer performs desire. She embodies it. That is the secret most men never learn. You cannot unlock her shadow by seduction. You unlock it by stability, by being still enough for her chaos to find safety in your silence. Because every woman's darkness hides one truth, that her deepest power was never meant to be controlled, only witnessed. And once that darkness is seen without fear, it turns to light. The descent into the shadow is never gentle. It begins as curiosity, but it ends as confrontation. For when the dark feminine awakens, she drags everything false into the light. Every illusion of safety, every performance of control, every unhealed wound disguised as charm. Jung wrote that the shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be. For a woman, that thing is often her untamed hunger for truth, for power, for emotional honesty. It's the part she was taught to bury beneath politeness, productivity, and prettiness. But suppression doesn't purify. It only pressurizes. And eventually, the mask fractures. That fracture is the beginning of freedom. When a woman begins to meet her shadow, it's rarely graceful. It's trembling, volatile, sacred in its imperfection. She may lash out, withdraw, seduce, test each act in unconscious attempt to see if her darkness can exist without being punished. This is not manipulation. This is initiation. The dark feminine is not the villain, she's the mirror of everything the world denied her. She is Lilith, refusing to kneel. Persephone descending into Hades, not as a victim, but as a seeker of depth. She is the silence that turns into song once she's no longer afraid of being heard. The descent is the psyche's way of reclaiming power through awareness. It is not the act of becoming darker, but of becoming whole, because you cannot embody light if you still fear the places where it hides. When she descends, she begins to see that her good girl persona was not virtue, it was survival. It was the armor she wore to be loved in a world that only rewards compliance. But the soul can only pretend for so long. Eventually, the armor becomes too heavy, and the feminine collapses into her truth. This collapse is the dark night of the anima. It's the moment when everything she thought she was, the polite, the pleasing, the perfect, begins to die. And in that death, she discovers her real pulse. The shadow feminine is not ashamed of her emotions. She cries and lets the world see. She desires without apology. She gets angry and doesn't call it irrational. She stops explaining her boundaries and begins embodying them. At first, the world calls her dangerous, and she is to illusion, to hypocrisy, to the subtle manipulations that masquerade as love. But to the conscious, she is medicine, because her chaos is not random, it's intelligent. It dismantles everything built on fear, inviting truth to take its place. The man who meets her here must learn not to fix her, but to witness her descent. He must stand as structure, not savior. Because if he tries to rescue her from her darkness, he becomes another figure of control. And the dark feminine cannot love where she cannot breathe. In Jungian terms, this is the alchemical nigredo, the blackening, the stage where all forms dissolve. It's the death of innocence and the birth of awareness. Everything false must burn before truth can be reborn. During this phase, her attraction may appear erratic. She'll oscillate between tenderness and distance, warmth and withdrawal. But this is not inconsistency, it's integration. Each polarity she expresses is a part of her psyche finding voice. Every shift is her unconscious testing. Can you hold me in all my forms? If your presence remains unbroken, not by indulgence, but by awareness, she begins to settle. Because what her shadow fears most is rejection disguised as acceptance. The moment she senses you want her to be better, she retreats into the mask. But if you can meet her gaze without demand, if your eyes say, "I see you even here," she begins to bloom from within. And that blooming is not gentle. It's fierce, holy, ancient. It's the resurrection of every silenced woman through the body of one who finally remembers herself. This is the descent Jung called the integration of the shadow. It's where the feminine reclaims her sacred rage, her intuitive hunger, her creative fire, not to dominate, but to balance. Because real power is never about control. It's about coherence, the merging of softness and strength into a single truth. When she arrives here, she no longer wants to be worshipped or obeyed. She wants to be understood. And in that understanding, she invites the masculine into his own descent, because no man can meet the dark feminine until he has faced his own. The confrontation begins not between two lovers, but between two mirrors. When the dark feminine finally awakens, she stops orbiting around approval and begins demanding truth, not through words, but through energy, through silence that cuts deeper than accusation, through presence that exposes what charm once concealed. She has entered her eclipse stage, the meeting point of light and shadow, where illusion dies. Here, every man who seeks her will face a choice, evolve or retreat, because the dark feminine is not a fantasy. She is the test of awareness itself. She doesn't want your admiration. She wants your honesty, and she can sense the difference in an instant. When she looks at you, she's not asking, "Do you want me?" She's asking, "Can you stand in your own depth while I show you mine?" This is where the polarity becomes mythic, the point where the masculine's stillness meets the feminine's storm. He must hold his awareness as she dismantles every disguise, every projection, because she will not let you stay small in her presence. She will seduce your shadow out of hiding, tempt your ego into confession, force you to meet the parts of yourself you buried under discipline and logic. That's the paradox of desire. The very energy that attracts you to her is the same energy that terrifies you. She is chaos made sacred. And your response to her chaos determines your consciousness. The dark feminine doesn't rage to destroy, she rages to reveal. She shows you where control still masquerades as protection, where fear still hides behind masculinity. If you defend yourself, the dance dies. If you listen, truly listen, without trying to fix, dominate, or escape, the transformation begins. She confronts not to humiliate, but to awaken. When she says, "I don't trust you," she's not testing your strength, she's naming her wound. When she pulls away, she's not rejecting your love, she's checking if it still exists when her light fades. Her behavior, erratic to the untrained eye, is simply the psyche's choreography of integration. Jung wrote that no union of opposites can occur without tension. In this tension, she and you are no longer two people, but two archetypal forces balancing creation and destruction. The feminine expands, the masculine anchors. The storm meets the shore. And yet, this balance can only survive through consciousness. Because if the masculine collapses into control, the feminine will retaliate. And if the feminine collapses into chaos, the masculine will withdraw. The polarity then dies in projection. She becomes too much. He becomes too distant. But when both remain present, something extraordinary happens. The confrontation becomes communion. The dark feminine does not soften through logic. She softens through safety. Not the safety of promises, but of presence. When she senses that her darkness can exist without judgment, she begins to trust the space again. And in that trust, her aggression transforms into intimacy. The same lips that challenged now confess. The same eyes that burn now shimmer with tears. Because the feminine doesn't truly want power, she wants permission to be whole. To be loved in her entirety. The sacred and the savage. The holy and the hungry. And the man who can meet her here without shrinking becomes something more than a lover. He becomes the container of transformation. The structure through which her chaos becomes creation. But this is not submission, it is symmetry. He holds not because she is weak, but because she is vast. She trusts not because he dominates, but because he doesn't need to. This is the highest form of polarity, not attraction through fantasy, but evolution through reflection. Her shadow calls forth his integrity. His awareness calls forth her surrender. Together, they form the sacred paradox. The flame that doesn't burn. The storm that doesn't destroy. The love that doesn't bind. In this confrontation, both lose what they once were. He loses his armor. She loses her mask. And what remains is not perfection, but presence. Two souls stripped to their archetypal essence, masculine as consciousness, feminine as being. This is what Jung meant by conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites that births the self. Not a romance, but an alchemy. Not a relationship, but a revelation. And once both have faced this mirror, the old dynamics of power dissolve. She no longer needs to provoke to feel alive. He no longer needs to control to feel safe. Both begin to love not to escape themselves, but to recognize themselves through one another. When that happens, the shadow no longer hides. It breathes. It becomes the soil of something transcendent, desire turned into devotion, polarity turned into peace. When the storm quiets, what remains is not peace but presence. The air feels heavier, charged with something ancient and tender. The battle between light and dark has ended, not because one triumphed, but because both were seen. The feminine no longer hides her shadow. The masculine no longer fears his depth. Together, they stand in the afterglow of truth. This is where desire becomes consciousness, where attraction stops being hunger and turns into recognition. Because what the dark feminine wanted was never control, it was coherence. To feel her own power reflected back to her without distortion. To see that her chaos could be held without shame, that her darkness could exist in love's light and remain whole. When a woman integrates her shadow, she becomes still. No submissive still. Her energy no longer oscillates between proving and pleasing. She no longer performs softness. She is softness unforced, unwavering, alive. Her sensuality returns, not as temptation, but as truth. She walks like someone who has forgiven herself for being powerful. This is the rebirth of the dark feminine. She becomes both the storm and the shore. the mirror and the moonlight, the wound and the wisdom. Every polarity within her now dances in harmony. The saint embraces the sinner. The lover forgives the warrior. Her eyes hold the depth of every emotion she once hid, yet they no longer demand redemption. Jung said that integration of the shadow leads to individuation, the birth of the self. And the self is not perfection. It is totality. The woman who has met her shadow is not afraid of being misunderstood. She knows that truth rarely receives applause. She no longer chases love to feel worthy. She radiates worth and lets love find her frequency. To the unconscious man, she is intimidating. To the conscious man, she is home. Because she no longer plays the archetypes, she embodies them. She can be the lover without losing her independence, the nurturer without becoming selfless, the seductress without shame, the sovereign without cruelty. She has become paradox incarnate, and paradox is power purified. For him, too, something changes. The man who has stood through her storm finds himself transformed. Her darkness refined his patience. Her vulnerability tested his integrity. Her honesty demanded his presence. And in meeting all of it without retreat, he discovered that strength has nothing to do with domination and everything to do with awareness. Together, they represent the new myth of polarity, not master and muse, not pursuer and pursued, but two forces remembering their symmetry. The dark feminine no longer needs to provoke to be seen. The conscious masculine no longer needs to fix to feel valuable. Their connection becomes less about intensity and more about clarity. They are no longer two halves seeking completion. They are two wholes creating resonance. That is the essence of sacred attraction. It doesn't consume, it reveals. It doesn't chase, it recognizes. It doesn't promise eternity, it delivers presence. When the dark feminine and conscious masculine meet here, something mythic occurs. Desire evolves into devotion, and polarity evolves into peace. The game ends, and the dance begins. She no longer fears her reflection. She becomes it. Her shadow, once exiled, now sits beside her like an old friend. She no longer fights to be good. She has remembered how to be whole. And that wholeness radiates like quiet fire, not to attract, but to awaken. Because every man who meets her feels it, the call to rise, not to conquer her, but to match her consciousness. This is the power of the integrated woman. She is not light, pretending to be kind. She is light that has made peace with the dark. Her love is no longer the reward for your behavior. It's the mirror of your own becoming. The dark feminine is not here to destroy the masculine. She is here to refine him just as he refines her. Together, they create balance, not battle. Truth, not tension. Union, not ownership. And in that union, the deepest secret of desire is revealed. The shadow was never the enemy of love. It was the doorway to it. So when she finally looks at you, not through seduction, but through stillness, you realize she's not asking to be unlocked. She already is. She doesn't need saving. She needs seeing. And the moment you see her fully, the dark, the divine, the dangerous, you realize that she was never darkness at all. She was the mirror showing you where the light begins. The woman who understands her desire no longer chases love, she becomes it.